All right, welcome to the video on Unit 1, Introduction to Polynomials, Lesson 0.2, Representation of Functions. This video, we're going to be exploring function notation and how to evaluate a function. As you're watching the video, you should pause whenever you need to copy down notes as necessary. Okay, so this unit is all about polynomials, and generally, when we see polynomials, we see them written as y is equal to some expression. In this case, we have a linear function. It's y is equal to 2x minus 3. When we use function notation, we replace the y with this f of x. And so y and f of x are essentially the same thing. So how would we read this equation? For this equation, we would say f of x equals 2x minus 3. Go ahead and write that down. And when you're done, we're going to move on to the bottom half of this page. All right, so we talked about how to read the expression. Now let's look at the parts of a function formula when we're writing it in function notation. It's important to keep in mind that there's always three parts to the function formula: input, output, and rule. The input is the independent variable, which is your x. The output is the dependent variable, which is y, or again using function notation f of x. And the rule is the formula we plug x into to get y. So let's take a look at how we do that here. The independent variable can be any number that's within the domain, and so you can just pretty much choose whatever you want. For this function, let's see what we get when we plug in 4 for x. So again, x is our input, and we're just going to replace x with 4 in the formula. So wherever I see an x, I'm going to put a 4. So I'm going to get now 2 times 4 minus 3, which when we solve it out, gives me an output of 5. Let's be clear about this. My input is 4, and when I plug that into our formula, I get an output of 5, which is the y value. Go ahead and pause and copy down notes as necessary. Once you have the notes down, you should move on to activity 1, which is on the next page. For this activity, what you're going to do is you are going to plug in the values that are put in the input box, so all the values found in the input box, into the formulas for the x, right? So wherever you see an x, you're just going to replace it with the numbers you see in the input box, and the answer you get will be your output. Now we're going to move on to evaluating functions. Before we talk about that, there's a couple of corrections I want us to make here. So where it says question, what's y, what's x here, I want you to go ahead and cross out the y's and x's. And then on this side where it says when x is, when y is, cross out the x's and the y is. Go ahead and do that. And the reason why I'm having you do that is because I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I want you to actually think about what you're asking yourself. All right, so let's begin. When you're asked to evaluate a function, the key word there is value. You're trying to find a particular value. So in this first example, we're given this same function as before, f of x equals 2x minus 3, and we're asked to evaluate it at f of 2. We read this as f of 2. So notice how we substituted the x with a 2. We're going to do that same thing over here. So essentially what we're asking ourselves, this is our question, what's y when x is equal to 2? Now in order to get that, what we need to do is, just as we've substituted the x on this side for a 2, we need to substitute the x on this side of the equation for a 2 as well, to solve for our y, or our output, as we could call it that. And when we do that, we get the output to be -2. So that means that if we were asked to evaluate f of 2, the answer in this case would be -1. Let's take a look at example number 2, doing the same thing. So why don't you go ahead and try and think about what question you're asking yourself here and see if you can evaluate the function. Pause the video, and when you come back, I'll give you the answer. Okay, so looking at this, again, I'm substituting the x for a number, which is 4. The question I would ask myself is, what's y when x is 4? And to find out what y is when x is 4, I need to substitute the x on this side by 4. And I did that in the previous slides, so we know the answer here is 5. That means that f of 4 is equal to 5. We have one more example, which is example 3. Notice that there's a difference between example 3 and what we started off with, example 2 and 1. In example 3, the x has not been replaced by a number, but f of x has. So what does that mean? That means that we know what our value of y is. Remember, f of x is the same thing as y. So we know y is equal to -5. What we're looking for in this case is we're looking for the value of x. We want to know what value of x do we have when y is equal to -5. So just like in example 1 and 2, we have to do some sort of substitution. Since we know our value of y, we're going to substitute the y with -5. So I go ahead and do that. And then all I need to do is solve for x. So I'm going to do that over on the side here, my scratch work. So I rewrite the equation, and I want to isolate the x. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 2 to isolate my x, and I get x is equal to -1. So if I'm asked to evaluate f of x equals -5 for this function, I would say x is equal to -1. Okay, so now you have that information. The next activity, activity 2 and 3, I'm going to give you a little information about what you're going to do. For activity 2, what you're asked to do is just label the representations. So it's either going to be a graph, formula, or equation, data table, or ordered pair. So you just have to label them. Then in activity 3, you're asked to evaluate the function. So just remember that when you see f of a number, that means you're going to plug in x equals that number. So f of 8, I would plug in 8 for my x and solve for y. And when you see f of x equals a number, you're going to plug in that number for y and solve for x. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or stop by in the morning or after school. Have a quality evening.